king who was chosen by God to replace the ungodly King Saul. And so much of David's life is a picture of Jesus who is to come later. But I'm going to suggest to you that the passage we're about to read is not one of those parts of David's life, because this is where probably one of the godliest men in the Bible gets it wrong, big time. And we'll think in a little while about why these things are here, but the Bible is an honest book. And our temptation always, if we do wrong, is to try and cover it up and pretend it didn't happen, hope nobody saw it. But the Bible exposes people for what they are, including you and me. But don't lose heart, because I'll talk today and let you know that this wasn't the end of David's walk with God. He was restored. And next Sunday, we're going to look a little bit deeper at how David found forgiveness, even though there were still consequences for his sin. I haven't told you the passage yet, have I? 2 Samuel chapter 11. It's on page 314 of the Church Bible, if you've got one of the Pew Bibles. If you haven't and you'd like one, we can certainly get one to you. So 2 Samuel chapter 11, probably a well-known story, sadly, of David and Bathsheba. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of his palace. From the roof, he saw a woman washing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I am pregnant." So David sent this word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. David was told Uriah did not go home. So he asked Uriah, "Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to him, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him, so that he will be struck down and die." So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Joab sent David a full account of the battle. He instructed the messenger, "When you have finished giving the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up, and he may ask you, 'Why did you get so close to the city to fight?' Didn't you know they would shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbesheth? Didn't a woman drop an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died in Thebez? Why did you get so close to the wall? If he asks you this, then say to him, moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. The messenger set out. When he arrived, he told everything Joab had sent him to say. The messenger said to David, the men overpowered us and came out against us in the open, but we drove them back to the entrance of the city gate. Then the archers shot arrows at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. David told the messenger, say this to Joab, don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. Say this to encourage Joab. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Amen. Let's sing again. 529, O worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. 529. Do you ever surprise yourself by how sinful you are at times? Do you find yourself in a situation where you suddenly realize that you've done something that you bitterly regret in spite of your best intentions of doing good? Now, in the story of David, we can take comfort that if we are already Christians and we already know God, that even if we do sin, there is forgiveness. But this story is not written to encourage us to sin. Let me make that clear. But even if we don't yet know Christ, if we don't know what it means to be a Christian, we can see ourselves in this story. Because the Bible tells us that God made you and me in his image, but that we have fallen because of our sin, and we're no longer the people that God made us to be. And in our world at large, people are having all sorts of problems trying to work out who they are. And they've got to the point now, it seems, where you are who you want to be. But the Bible says you are who God made you to be. And by knowing him, we can be who he wants us to be. This story is a story we can take comfort in, but more than that, it's a story in which we can look at what happened, what went wrong for David, and examine ourselves to make sure that we are going to continue walking faithfully with the Lord and not make the same mistake. My mum used to say to me, and I'll probably quote her a couple of times this morning, I often do, but she often used to say to me, if I got something wrong, you learn from your mistakes. And sometimes it was a bit longer. She'd say the best way to learn is from your mistakes. And then I came to realize she was only partly right, because the best way to learn is from other people's mistakes, so that you don't make the same ones. And when it comes to something like adultery, let me absolutely assure you, learn not to make the mistake. Don't think, I'll learn when I make it, and then I'll never do it again. The thing is, we have this wonderful picture of David, the king after God's own heart, who was chosen long before he became king, and who waited patiently on God. He didn't try and take matters into his own hands. He never raised a hand against Saul, the previous king, even though Saul was out to kill him. David was godly in so many ways. But it's a mistake to think of him as near perfect. He was as weak as you and me. Now, here we have the story. How does it start? In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, what did David do? He sent Joab. Hang on. It's a time when kings go to war. What did David do? He sent someone else, and it says he stayed at Jerusalem. David had been appointed as king by God, and part of his role as king was to protect God's people, the nation. And in the spring, when conditions start to get more favorable, that's when, in those days, your nation would be attacked by all the different tribes and nations around you. It was David's job to go and protect God's people, but he sent somebody else and he stayed at home. First question for us to consider is, are we doing the Lord's work? Are we fighting his battles? We're not called to take a sword and go out and fight like David was. But we are called to be witnesses, to be those who share our faith with others, to be those who, as that last hymn said, we worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. If we're engaged in God's work, then God can use us. But David wasn't. He remained in Jerusalem. And one evening, he got up from his bed. Don't know what he was doing in bed in the evening. He'd obviously was relaxing and taking things a bit easy. And he walks around on the roof. And from there, he saw a woman washing. Now, it's interesting that the narrator, the person who writes this story, never anywhere blames Bathsheba for what went on. But I do ask the question, what was she doing taking a bath in the place where if the king could see her, she could see him? And there is some suggestion that maybe she wanted to attract attention. But for David, it was one look that attracted his eyes, and then he decided that he wanted to take her for himself. And it all came because he wasn't doing the work that God wanted him to do. My mum, I told you I'd quote her. Do you know what she used to say to me? She used to say, "The devil finds work for idle hands." I used to think that was in the Bible. It isn't. But it's nevertheless true. When we're not engaged in something good, that's when the temptation comes to do something bad. This sin took time. The sin wasn't in the look, but see what happened afterwards. So he saw this woman from the roof in verse 2, and she was very beautiful. He sent someone to find out about her. So he's now, the cogwheels of his mind are ticking. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Now, surely the warning bells would have rung in David's mind at that point, don't you think? Who is this woman? She's somebody's wife. But David straight away in verse 4 sent messengers to get her. She came to him and he slept with her. David saw, he inquired, he took, he sinned. Those are the steps that you will find anytime you sin and go away from God. David could have stopped and avoided this sin in a lot of stages. For example, David the king, before he became king, was aware that God had commanded that the kings of Israel, the kings of God's people, were not to take multiple wives. What did David do? We can look in the Bible and find names of at least 6 of his wives, and certainly more than 10 concubines, which were, we're not quite sure what the relationship was. David's self-discipline in the area of women was clearly weak. Somebody said, take a lion for a pet, and one day it will turn on you. But in spite of David having all these women at his disposal, if I dare use such an awful phrase when it comes to women, he still wanted the one he hadn't got. David could have done his duty and gone out to battle, and then he wouldn't have been walking on the roof of his palace. He could have been active and not lazing around. He could have listened to the servant say she was Uriah's wife. And even after she arrived at the palace, he could have recognized that he was in the wrong and that he should not be doing what he had planned to do. All of those were opportunities for David to have not gone down this path that led to such a terrible sin, not just adultery, but then having Uriah killed because he wouldn't conform to David's plan to cover up for his sin. It's interesting that when he gets Uriah there, and Uriah doesn't go to sleep with his wife as David hoped that he would, and David challenges him and says, didn't you go home? Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home? Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. Those words must have really stung when David heard them, because he knew what he had done. He knew what he should have been doing. And Uriah's effectively, without knowing it, saying, because I was doing what you weren't doing, I'm not going to do what you did. Can you see that? A.W. Pink says, beware of the beginnings of sin. Concealment leads downwards. Pride will go to great lengths to protect a reputation. Disregarding conscience leads to callousness. And it certainly did here with David. Alan Redpath has said, there is never a day in any man's life but that he is dependent upon the grace of God for power and the blood of Jesus for cleansing. And we'll see when we come to look at the next chapter next week, where God, having seen what David has done, and not only seen what he's done, but seen how he is not repentant, because not only is he covering up his adultery by murdering Uriah, but then we will learn that actually a child is born even before David confesses and repents. This went on for a year or more, that David had committed sin. He knew he was guilty, but he was trying to cover it up and ignore it and pretend it didn't matter until God sent the prophet to challenge him. There's a verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Let me turn to it. 1 Corinthians 10 and verses 12 to 13. It says, so if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Why do you think this story is in the Bible? Well, obviously, it's here to show us how much God can forgive and how willing God is to forgive those who are repentant. But actually, we're not at that point in the story yet. I believe this is not here so that we can excuse ourselves, and when we sin, we can say, oh, well, it doesn't matter because David did something worse. I've never committed adultery. I've never committed murder. So the Bible tells me I must be okay because I'm not as bad as him. That's not what it's there for. Verse 27, we see the thing David had done displeased the Lord. That's the first message for us. That God sees who we are, he sees what we do, and when we fail, we need to confess it and keep short accounts with him and not try and cover it up. It shows us that past obedience is no guarantee of future faithfulness. We have to keep relying on God at all times. Sadly, there are many Christian leaders, even in our day, who have done tremendous works for God, leaders of big churches and great works, who have sinned, some through adultery, some through other sins. The fact that you've got a great track record is no guarantee that you will remain faithful. You need to be constantly relying on God for his grace to keep you close to him. It's here because it shows the dreadful consequences of sin. I wonder if David had realized that his adultery was going to result in murder, would that have stopped him doing it? It shows the power of grace. And we'll see in due course how Bathsheba becomes the mother of Solomon, the next king. And she's in the line of Christ. It also shows that there are certain areas for all of us where we need to be especially on our guard. The devil always attacks us on our weakest points, and we need to be sure that we are following the Lord closely. Job was the first book of the Bible to be actually penned, so the historians tell me. But in Job 31, verse 1, when all his helpers were trying to suggest that he must have sinned, he must have looked on a woman lustfully. And Job says, I've made a covenant with my eyes. He was determined not to fail in that area. And in Numbers 15, verse 39, we have the priests in the temple, and they're told what to wear. And they're told that on their gown, there are to be 2 tassels attached to the gown. And when they look at those tassels, it is to remind them of God's goodness to his people. So they have specific reminders so they don't forget. Well, David, if he'd been following the Lord and doing what the Lord had told him, this would never have happened. But he took his eyes off the Lord and looked somewhere else. The challenge for us is, are we determined to keep serving God faithfully? But we can be forgiven. David was forgiven. As I say, we'll look at that next week. So no one needs despair because Jesus died for us so that all of our wrong could be forgiven and we could have a living relationship with God. Let's sing with number 501. O Jesus, I have promised to serve thee to the end. Be thou forever near me, my master and my friend. 501.